This is Dialogue, a weekly conversation where creativity meets technology. This episode of Season 1 is brought to you by Astropad and OneBlocker. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm hanging in there. Here we are, Federico, finally at the final episode of Season 1 of Dialogue. It's been kind of a long journey. It's been fun, but boy, it seems like we've been doing this for a while now.
I feel like this season began 3 years ago.
I know, not 12 weeks ago. I mean, through the magic of podcasting, it did begin for us a little bit earlier than 12 weeks ago. But yes, it does seem very long. But it's been fascinating, I think, for me to meet and talk to all these people who we've talked to throughout the season. I mean, they're all writers, but they've all come from such different backgrounds and do such different things that it's kind of fascinating to see both the commonalities, but also the differences between what each of them does and how they approach writing and the process and everything. And it's been, just, I guess, to remind listeners too, this episode is just you and me. We're closing out the season.
Yes.
Where we're going to kind of do a wrap up and talk a little bit about what we've learned and the things we've discussed with all of our guests. And then we're going to take a little break. And I don't know how long the break's going to be just yet. We're going to figure that out as we go along. But we'll be back with a season 2 eventually. And we'll have another topic. Won't be writers and writing. It'll be some other topic. We haven't decided what that will be yet. But we will be back eventually with that.
Yeah, I still cannot believe that we interviewed Pierce Brown, honestly, because I'm now in the process so I'm writing myself.
Right.
The summer for me is when I write my iOS reviews, and this year in particular, I'm working on this review, which is not one but 2 operating systems in one. And I thought initially I want to write a shorter review. Even though it's 2 operating systems, it's going to be fine. And I vastly underestimated the scope of the project. And I'm now in the situation where I have this massive thing that I'm working on, and I'm still writing. I'm not yet at the editing stage. And so I mentioned Pierce Brown because reading Dark Age, which is the latest book in the Red Rising series, is basically my only distraction. Like, I try and read for 1 or 2 hours before bed, but I'm just so exhausted that, for example, last night I fell asleep with the page open on my iPad, and I woke up.
It's a long book too, isn't it?
It is extremely long on my iPad. With my font size, it is over 800 pages.
Oh, wow.
And the font size is not too big, honestly. So it's that's my only distraction. And I really can't believe that we managed to interview Pierce. But of course, we interviewed a bunch of folks. I mean, we started with John Gruber. He's one of my role models for studying Mac stories. And, we had some really great folks. And I think what we wanted to do for this last episode of this season is sort of recap some of the ideas and some of the major themes, some of the different approaches that we've discussed in terms of writing and sharing your own work. And I thought maybe, John, a possible way to start by, sort of recapping all that we've discussed is the idea of getting started. Getting started with writing and getting started with publishing your own work. Because, when you write for yourself, it's still writing, but it can be, when you only have an audience of 1, it's not that different from journaling, really, and having a diary. But when you publish your own work, I think that's when everything becomes real, in a way.
Yeah, I think that is a good place to start. And, you and I both had our big fan moments. I mean, it was great talking to everybody, but I also am a kind of a huge fan of Frank Turner, and interviewing him was, especially getting to interview him and then going straight up to Madison, Wisconsin to see a show of his was a really fun day for me. So I'll admit to that one as well. But in terms of getting started, as I listen to these and get them ready for publication, I've been thinking about what each person has had to say about different aspects of the questions we asked. And getting started was one of the areas that we talked to a lot of people about. And it really struck me that, I guess it shouldn't be too much surprise that with Mac Stories, inspired in large measure by Daring Fireball, that in some ways, you and John Gruber really had very similar starts to the way you began writing, because I know I think we talked about it in the first episode, but we definitely have talked about it on App Stories before when I interviewed you. You got started writing on forums and Apple forums in Italy, right? I mean, I forget the name of the site, but you were writing about forums, and I think Sylvia convinced you that maybe you should do this as a job instead of just wasting your time on the forums, right?
It was the Games Radar forum, and was writing about video games mostly. Yeah.
Right. And John, he wrote a BBEdit script at one point for a customer to figure out how many words the person had typed in email over a period of time. And he ran it on his own email, and he realized that working support and doing documentation and all sorts of things for that, he had actually written tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of words. And to me, that's not unlike kind of your experience with the forums. And then both of you actually ended up, working, going on to work on your own site, which, struck me as very similar, as opposed to someone like Pierce Brown, who took a very different approach, I think, from anyone else we talked to, which was he just dove in writing books. And I think as he said, his first 3 or 4 books weren't published, and going back at them, I think he does what a lot of writers do. When you look at your old work, you kind of cringe a little bit. It's a little hard to read your old stuff, but yeah, he just dove in and wrote and kept writing until he got to a point where he had something that was, something that a publisher was interested in.
I think it's interesting, the way that I started writing on forums and the way that Gruber started by working at Barebones, that was a different type of writing, of course, but I feel like it allowed us to channel our interests in a way that let us discover the topic that we'll eventually be writing about for a living,
right,
in a different context. And so I was, admittedly, Sylvia was right. I was wasting hours every day just arguing with strangers on a forum that didn't pay me to write and share
right.
my thoughts. That's the thing with forums. People just talk and argue and share ideas. But it allowed me to sort of understand this is a topic that I'm passionate about. This is something that I want to write about for a living. And I think it can apply to a bunch of other folks. I see in browsing Reddit and being on Twitter, I see so often people investing their time in sharing these long, detailed threads. Like I've seen folks on Reddit publish guides and tutorials about shortcuts or iPad. And I'm not trying to say that they shouldn't do it, but my advice would always be you should own your work. And by that, I mean you shouldn't, you can continue sharing your thoughts on social media and other platforms, but you should also have your own place. You should have your own web domain. You should have your own website, your own server that you actually control, where you can point people to. Because investing hours into researching a topic only to publish that on a website that you don't control, on a social network where your content is moderated and where you need to be subject to the comments of people that maybe you don't want to have at the bottom of your creation. Whenever I see these people, I wish that they would consider just having a blog. And it's super easy these days. There's blogging platforms and tools that are, buying a domain name is super cheap. And the same goes for these threads that I see on Twitter. These threads that, especially now that you can use 280 characters.
Right.
I see these threads made up of like 30, 40 different messages. That should be a blog post, honestly. And that's not to say that you shouldn't use social media. I mean, we've talked about it in this season. Social media is an excellent tool to share your own work and to engage with other people, to engage with fans and readers. But it's so, I had this idea before doing this season, and I came away convinced that idea is more important than ever. You should own your work. You should put your name on it. You should put it on your website. You should publish a book or whatever it is. Do not trust other platforms and other people alone with your work.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I mean, I think that's definitely something that came shining through with our conversations, because Yeah, I mean, you and John started in a very similar way where you didn't control those words, but
No.
you very quickly transitioned to using your own website. And I'm glad you raised social media because that's another thing that we talk to a lot of people about. And the role of social media, as I see it, when you're a writer, is to amplify your work, not to replace your work, right? It's a way to connect with the people who you might not otherwise be able to connect to with your website, who might not be familiar with it. And it's just another avenue to explain to people where to go to find your ideas. I mean, I don't think it should be a replacement for where you publish the ideas themselves. So yeah, that definitely came through, especially with John. I know when we spoke to him, but also with somebody like when we spoke to Frank Turner, he talked a lot about how he doesn't even keep Twitter on his phone anymore because he doesn't like the negative aspects of it, which we're all far too familiar with these days. But on the other hand, as someone who is essentially running a business and publishing his work, his songs, that is an incredibly effective way for him to both get people to know about his new album coming out, his tour dates, charities that he supports, all those things, which is really no different than a lot of the way we use Twitter every day.
Yeah, I agree. And again, I want to stress how I'm not trying to disown of social media and saying, I owe so much to Twitter. It was the only, because I never really used Facebook for sharing my own stuff. I do every once in a while post a message about a long article or a personal story that I've written, and I publish it on Facebook for my Italian friends. But really, I owe so much to Twitter, especially in the early days when Mac Stories was just getting started. It was a way for me to find an audience and to get in touch with people to the point where I was actually kind of spammy about it, really. But that's the way that I learned, and that's the way that I eventually managed to convert. And convert is really an ugly word, but it is what it is, to turn those readers into Mac Stories Club members, for example. So I'm not trying to say that social media is not something that I found beneficial. I do, but I just could not imagine not posting my thoughts and reviews and editorials on Mac Stories and just sharing them on Twitter. And I think it's a shame that so many people wanna try and find a place in any community, whether it's about video games or tech or sports or politics, and all they do is share their thoughts on Twitter or Facebook. There's value in that, absolutely value in that, but I think as it pertains to writing, if you're interested in writing requires a safe place where you can share your writing, and I think that's one of the lessons that we've learned this in this season. For the kinds of writing, whether it's a song or you're writing for a movie or a blog post or a book, it's important that your name is on it and that your identity is on it. And instead, I feel like with social media, everything becomes just an object that is made up of likes and shares, and it doesn't really matter who shares it as long as it creates a reaction. Whereas I feel like writing deserves having its own place, deserves having your own name on it.
Right.
And I have social media. I feel like we've asked everyone about it in this season, and everyone came back with the same answer of, yeah, I use it to promote my own work, but really I try to stay off Twitter. That was basically...
Yes, there is a lot of that. And, the other thing about it too, I think, Federico, is that there's just not, Twitter's designed not to be a place of permanence. And if you think you've got ideas that are valuable that you want to share with other people, it makes more sense to do it in a way that's tied more closely to your name and that you own, whether it's a website or a book that's printed or a song that's published or whatever it is. That's a lot more permanent and tangible for people who are interested in your ideas than just tweeting, because while you can go back and search through all old tweets, it's not near. We know what the half-life of a tweet is. 30 minutes later, everybody's forgotten about what you had to say, pretty much.
Yeah. Another common theme that we discussed with all of our guests in this season was the idea, well, the idea of where ideas come from. And I think we've heard a lot of interesting, very diverse examples. Kari Patel, she mentioned how traveling through Argentina, granted her with the opportunity of just having time to think about writing, thinking about stories, and being inspired by her surroundings. And I thought that was really inspirational. The idea of traveling and just soaking into the culture and the place where you're in, and different environment that can
Right.
inspire you and that can give you ideas. And I wish I could do more of that myself, honestly.
Yeah, I've found that does make a difference, and I don't do it myself very often, but I understand where she's coming from because I actually was in Argentina a few years after she was doing similar type of trip, and there were such long bus rides between all these little towns in Argentina, and you had nothing to do other than to think, and giving yourself time to sit and be quiet and just think through ideas is super valuable. And it's one of those things that's easy to just kind of push out of your day because you don't have, you've got a lot to do and you figure, well, I'll get to that another time. It doesn't have to be traveling on a bus through Argentina. I think that kind of thinking time and idea and inspiration time can be gained just by going for a long walk or something and leaving behind the podcasts and maybe just even leaving behind the music and just thinking, and maybe throw a notebook in your pocket and write down anything that comes to you. I know that before you and I worked together, I used to sit in a coffee shop before I would take the train into work. And every Friday I would take like an hour in this coffee shop and just make a long list of things that I thought might be good ideas of things to do, projects. And, one of those eventually led to the article that I sent you, and that it was a useful thing to do, but there were a lot of really bad ideas in those lists too. And it was just a matter of kind of picking through them and trying to find the ones that might be useful to follow up on that eventually led to doing what I'm doing today.
Yeah, that is something that I always try and do every once in a while. The idea of letting go, even just momentarily, of all the tasks that I see in my to-do list. And maybe this applies just to me, but I think there's something that maybe can be gleaned from it. I just sit down, for example, just did this morning. I try not to think about the things that I needed to write, and the chapters that are still not done. And I just looked at my phone. And I mean, that pertains to me because looking at my phone and looking at apps is part of what I read about.
Right.
But I just reorganized things, without music, without podcasts going on in the background. Just looked at my phone, reorganized my apps, and created a bunch of folders and took notes of ideas of like, yeah, maybe this is something we can write about in September. Maybe this is something that I shouldn't write about, but maybe John or Ryan can write about it. And so just letting go for like 30 minutes or an hour of all the things that I'm supposed to be doing to take a look at the bigger picture. And, I think maybe I've always been this way, but inspiration, the idea of inspiration, of where does an idea come from? I think the environment and the context you're in is, of course, a factor. But I also think you need to put yourself in a position where inspiration can come to you.
Right.
Because if you're always busy and doing busy work, and, I see it, for example, when I'm writing my iOS review, nothing touches me in the sense of I'm just heads down. I have this tunnel vision. All I know, all I care about is the review and writing the review, looking at my notes, looking at my mind map, and getting the writing done. But I'm not in a mood to let inspiration strike me, or to let, new ideas come to me. And I think it's important whenever I'm heads down in a big project, because there's other things that I want to do, and because maybe there's a new ideas that I can incorporate in that project. I think it's important to put yourself in the position of letting the ideas actually come to you, because if you're always super laser focused on getting the writing done, new ideas, they may be avoiding you. That's
Right.
the way that I see it. I see myself sort of like a target, and ideas are like arrows. But if I don't present myself as a possible target for those ideas, well, they're just not gonna hit me, you know?
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And the other thing about it is too, I think when your head's down on a big project like you are right now, is that if you don't carve out at least some time to allow those ideas to hit you, what you'll find is you'll get to the end of that project, you'll publish it, and you'll have no idea what's next.
Yeah.
Because you'll have spent however many weeks it takes to get this done, and you'll be at that point where you're just exhausted and so glad that you're finished. But then you'll have this big dead zone where you don't create anything because you haven't really given yourself the room to think about what's next. Now, of course, you'll want to take a break once you're done with a huge project like this iOS review. On the other hand, though, you kind of want to know what's next, right? You want to be able to hit the ground running once you're refreshed a little bit. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, the other thing is, I think there are gradations of this sort of thinking and inspiring type of time that you take. I mean, I know that you and I both spend part of the time over the holidays thinking big picture about what we want to do for like the next 12 months or whatever on Mac Stories. And that is that's a time when I'll just sit down for 2 or 3 days and do nothing but kind of brainstorm ideas. And some of them, nothing comes of them. Others of them will actually become something like this podcast, for instance. Mm-hmm. And that's a really good time to do that, but I wouldn't want that to be the only time I do it, because I've also found that just sitting down on a Sunday afternoon when not much is going on and spending an hour or two thinking about the next week, thinking about what I want to get done, it's kind of planning to-do list stuff, but I also let it be time when I actually think about what things, be more purposeful about what things I want to write about the next week, maybe the next 2 weeks, maybe the next 3 weeks. And I think that kind of process, once you get in the habit of it, gets you to a place where you've got more ideas coming to you than you would if you just, spend a lot of time doing busy work all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Carving out time for new ideas, even though you're working on a big project, I've always find it super hard to do because sometimes I find it hard to justify not actually working on the project to think about, because it's hard to quantify what is the impact of new ideas when I could be putting 2 hours into actually finishing this chapter, for example. But I think I don't want to be in a situation where I finish the project and then when I publish it, I'm like, oh, but I could have done this new thing and this other new thing, and I could have maybe shared this different thought. And that's also part of why when I'm writing, especially this iOS review, I try not to read the thoughts of other people or watch too many videos about it. But at some point, I feel like I have to, because especially because it's a review, and I think it's my job to offer a fair assessment of an operating system. I think I need to expose myself to the ideas and thoughts from other people because maybe my perspective is limited. Now, right. Of course, it's a whole different conversation whether you're writing about software or you're writing news or you're writing fiction or you're writing for the video game. But I think in general, the idea of putting yourself in the position to let different ideas and concepts hit you, that's important. But it's also important to allow yourself to listen to ideas from different kinds of people, so that your perspective is not the only one that's thinking of what you need to write. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that does make sense. I mean, I have one other aspect of this that I want to raise too with you, which is it was really intriguing to me to hear Frank Turner talk about his notebooks and his notebooks with snippets of lyrics and chords and other things, some of which have been sitting there for years, right? And he revisits them every so often, and eventually they might make their way into a song that he publishes. But I've had similar experiences myself where sometimes I write these things down, sometimes I don't. There's not really a hard rule of thumb about it, but I find that if an idea is a good idea, it kind of sticks with you and it kind of sits in the back of your head and you work your way out. I mean, one of the best examples I can think of that where I surprised myself was I think when I finally quit my old job and started doing Mac Stories full time, I wrote an article called My App Story, and I talked a little bit about what led me to quitting that job and writing about technology and so forth. And actually, after I had written it completely, I went back through, I think it was drafts, and I found some old notes that I had taken when I was sitting on the train commuting back and forth to work, where I realized I found these notes and they were almost verbatim what I wrote in the article. And these notes were taken like a year plus before I actually wrote the article. And they'd just been sitting there with me for a really long time. And it just wasn't time to write about them, partly because I hadn't quit my job, but also because I hadn't completely thought through exactly how those things all fit together. And it eventually came to me and they were all there in the article. And so I try not to obsess too much about creating long lists of ideas in notes and that sort of thing. I kind of figure that if something's a good enough idea to write about, it'll stick with me and eventually it'll come back when the time is right to write it. I know that's kind of a weird, kind of amorphous way to describe it, but it seems to work for me over and over again.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I have notes for articles that I want to get to and that I keep promising myself, I'll get to this eventually. I'll write this eventually, but I never do because something always comes up. And for me, that process is fascinating because there are some ideas that are still valid. There are still, would be actually pretty good articles on the website. These are there are things that I would like to write about. But I also have to ask myself, if I never actually get to write about this, are they actually that interesting to me? Why am I keeping this here instead of publishing them? And so there are some things that I feel like I save in my notes because they're more aspirational at the moment rather than actual ideas that I need to turn into articles or reviews. And I don't know how to describe that, how I balance saving those ideas and promising myself, I'll get to this, but I never do. And if, I have very few examples of notes that I've kept for myself for over 2 years that eventually became articles on the website. Most of them, I think I delete when I just realize, I never do this. Honestly, it just
right.
Or maybe it becomes outdated and it's not relevant anymore,
Or maybe it surfaces in another way, right? It's not so much a good idea by itself, but it becomes an aspect of something else that you work on later. This 12th and final episode of Dialogue Season 1 is brought to you by Astropad Studio. I want to extend a special thank you to the team at Astro HQ. They've been with us since the very first episode of this first season of Dialogue, and Federico and I are both very grateful for their support and their assistance in getting this project off the ground. If you haven't tried their product yet, Astropad Studio, you really should because it can turn your iPad into a completely customizable graphics tablet. With Astropad, you can combine the power of the Apple Pencil with your favorite Mac apps. They understand that no two artists work alike, and that's why they've packed Astropad with opportunities to customize every aspect of your workflow with features like programmable gestures, custom pressure curves, and unlimited per-app shortcuts. They literally designed Astropad from the ground up for professional artists. Astropad also guarantees low latency performance over Wi-Fi or a USB cable, so you can set up your workspace on the go. It's a high-performance tool for the most demanding creative work, and today, Astropad is used by major animation studios and product design firms across the globe. So if you're ready to take your creative workflow to the next level, you can start your free 30-day trial of Astropad Studio today. Visit astropad.com to get started. Again, that URL to visit and try Astropad is astropad.com. Our thanks to Astropad Studio for their support of this season of Dialogue. All right, Federico, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about influences because it was very interesting to me to see that, for instance, Frank Turner and Pierce Brown are both huge history nerds. And I know you are a little bit of a history nerd yourself, and you probably don't know this about me, but I was too for a very long time. I've always been, some of my favorite books have been history books. And I thought that was kind of an interesting parallel between all those people who are into history. And then, you look at Carrie Patel and John Gruber. Both of them were huge readers. I mean, John worked at the Philadelphia Inquirer and used to sit reading the newspaper, which I think is a great perk of a job where you just sit around and read the newspaper. While Carrie was a huge book reader when she was younger, and I think that fostered her interest in both her novel writing and world creating, which she's done for Obsidian with the video games.
Yeah, that was I can absolutely relate to how history can be an influence, especially if if you agree with the idea that history is a cycle and things tend to repeat, and certain themes always stick with the human race despite the fact that hundreds of years have passed. So I can totally relate to that. What are your influences, John, for the type of writing that you do?
I don't know. I mean, I have always been a big reader until, I guess, recently. It's hard to, people say they don't read anymore. I read a lot, but I don't read books as much as I used to. And I always read a ton of books growing up and enjoyed history a lot too, because I kind of feel the same way that, history always repeats itself, and it's valuable to know history and understand where history may be taking us. But I think that those are probably my biggest influences. It's that, and I guess my training, just as my background as a lawyer, gives me a certain amount of. It influences the way I pick apart an app. I mean, I just breaking things down into their component parts, very much a lawyer thing, and I think that's useful when you're writing reviews to some degree. I mean, it can get in the way too, because you don't want to be just analytical about it. But that's another aspect of it.
Yeah, I think I also struggle to summarize what kind of influences I have. I guess, I've always been a huge video game nerd, and growing up, I spent hours reading not just books but also manga. I've always been into comics. I've always been into video games, and I've never really been a movie person. But I watch a lot of TV shows. There's something about, I don't know why, but it's something about the serialized format that I really like. And so there are some ideas and some themes and sometimes I use a quote that maybe comes from somewhere and that inspires me. And so I think those types of media have always been an influence for me. Music, of course, is another type of media that's been a huge part of myself growing up and starting Mac Stories. But I think in general, I don't know if maybe this doesn't make a lot of sense, but my readers influence me a lot in terms of what are, because of the type of writing that I do. I write about tech and I write about technology with some specific angles of like how to get the most out of an iPad, for example, or how to work and which apps to use. That's the kind of writing that I do. And I think being able to listen to readers and to understand their problems and the things they're struggling with or the things they are curious about is an influence for me in the sense that all these questions and ideas and comments that people send me, they have influenced me in my career, and they've sort of guided and provided some sense of direction for, where do I want to go with the things that I publish on Mac Stories. And I feel like, in a way, I can imagine how, for example, Pierce Brown may, to an extent, may be influenced by his readers. In with the Red Rising series,
right.
Especially, he's the type of person that goes on. Right now he's doing a book tour for Dark Age, and he talks to a lot of people, to a lot of fans that come up to him and share ideas and comments and questions. And so I can imagine how being able to answer those questions in a fiction, in a fiction type of writing, is writing a story. And if everybody wants to know what happened to Darrow in at the end of Golden Sun in the Red Rising series, I can imagine how being able to have all those questions makes you realize, maybe I should actually talk about this specific aspect. And so that becomes an influence. Having readers that share feedback with you, I think it absolutely can be a form of influence on your writing.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's interesting to me. I think about feedback a lot because I think feedback influences me, but I also try to recognize that sometimes the only feedback you get is from a very vocal minority. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I take that with, I suppose it's a grain of salt. Not that I don't believe it, but that I figure for every one person who has comment X, there are probably a bunch more people with the same comment, but also people who aren't saying anything to me about some other aspect of it. And when it really comes down to pushing what I do, what influences me very, very directly, where I guess I'll put it this way, there are very few people who I will listen to and not question. Where if someone tells me you're doing X wrong or you should do Y, where I'll listen to them without hesitation or question. There are very few people that I will do that with. But I do at the same time try to listen to all the feedback I get, no matter where it comes from, and get a sense for maybe, I guess, an aggregate kind of where it's pointing, which I think is really useful. I don't know. I mean, how do you deal with that? Because I think that's one of the issues. It kind of comes back to social media. I mean, you can let one negative comment spoil your whole day when there's probably 10,000 other people who thought your story was just perfectly fine and good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's absolutely true that sometimes the only feedback you get is from people who really want to send you feedback because something that you wrote, maybe upset them on a very personal level, or maybe it's something that they are super passionate about and they want to let you know about it.
Right.
But I keep thinking of something that CGP Grey said in one of the very first episodes of Cortex, that you may be getting hundreds of positive comments on something that you've published, but you get that one negative comment, and all you can think about is that one specific comment. Even though you got 200 people saying, congrats, that's awesome job, I really liked it. But then you get that one person that has a negative comment and a negative reaction to your work. And all you can do, because that's how the human brain works, all you can do is think about that single item of criticism.
Right.
And I also think how readers, I've just said that readers influence me. But on the other hand, it's not that I don't want to listen to feedback, but sometimes, because it is my job is to write and publish and create things. And sometimes maybe it's possible that some of my readers don't know yet. And I'm not trying to sound pretentious or anything, but it's just the way that creative work works. I think that sometimes people don't know yet what is that they're going to find entertaining, or what is it that they wanted to learn. Or maybe they're just surprised by an idea that they hadn't thought about before and that I have never seen in feedback or questions for people, but that I came up with myself. And going back 6 years ago, nobody was asking me to write about the iPad and turning the iPad into a laptop replacement, but I stuck with that idea no matter what. And so I think what is important here is to find a balance between listening to feedback, letting readers and the people who are going to consume what you write be an influence on you, but also sometimes it's important to stick to your principles and stick to your ideas and come up with writing about things that nobody asked you to write. And because you never know what people are going to find interesting or entertaining, and you're going to fail sometimes. I personally speaking, in the past I invested days into writing things that nobody asked me to do, and I thought, oh, this is genius, everybody's going to be surprised, and then nobody cared.
Right.
Because the idea was maybe not that interesting after all. But it's important to give yourself the sort of the wiggle room to try that. Ideas that nobody asked you to write. Because if you just write what people are asking you to write, well, then you're just running, a Q&A column. You're not really writing,
Right.
You're answering to people. And there's a balance there.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, I know you and I have both spoken many times about how we've both been in this situation where you're really excited about an idea, you get it out there, and then like, as far as you can tell, not a single person cares. And it happens. I mean, but it doesn't mean you should abandon it either. I mean, to me, sometimes those are the most important ideas because they're ideas that people aren't necessarily ready for, and maybe they are bad ideas, but maybe they're they're great ideas that are just not completely fully formed yet. And being able to figure that, I don't know how you figure that out. I think that's one of the things that you only discover through the process of working through the ideas, publishing them, and eventually seeing what happens. But that's a crazy process sometimes.
Yeah. A question that we've asked all of our guests in this first season is the role of luck, or call it fortune, and privilege and hard work in their careers. And this is a question that I really care about because I think about it. It's a topic that I think about all the time. Like, do I owe the fact that I now have an audience just to myself, or was it because I was born in a privileged environment, or was it because I was lucky? And I think it's the answer that we got from all of our guests in this season sort of matches what we've been arguing all along, in that it's absolutely a combination of all these three factors. But there's something that I think John August said that really struck me, and it stayed with me, and I keep thinking about that. Yes, he was born in a privileged environment, and he was lucky, and he absolutely worked hard. But I think it's important to, he said something along the lines of, it's important to put yourself in the path of luck. And the idea of it's not just necessarily about being lucky. It's not just necessarily about working super hard. I think maybe it's about working smart. I don't know how to summarize it, but the idea of you need to make sure that fortune and luck can hit you, can find you.
Right.
And whether that's about making the right connections, or networking, or thinking of new ideas, and writing about things that you were not expecting. But it's, the idea of luck needs to find you. And if you just write for yourself and never publish your work, well, luck is not going to find you. And if you want to have your book published, but you don't actually go to any publisher, you don't actually talk to nobody, and you just publish on your blog that 50 people read, well, it's really hard for luck to find you. So you're not exactly, making the most of your chances there. So the idea of the work needs to be there. But you also need to think of, if I want to break into, the publishing industry or the blogging industry, are there other things that I can do to put myself in the position where good things may happen to me and good things may happen to my career? That's sort of the way that I think about it.
Yeah, I think that's the right way to think about it, in that I feel like the hard work puts you in the position to take advantage of the luck, right?
Because you have the work to prove it. You have the actual work to prove that you've been writing, a book or a blog or songs, right? If the work isn't there, well, nobody's gonna read you, because there's no work.
Right, and the work gives you the skills so that you can, if lightning strikes and you have an opportunity to take something that you were doing in obscurity to something that is now somehow, for whatever reason, viewed by thousands of people, you put yourself in the position to be able to take advantage of that luck, because now you've already got the skills. Maybe you've been writing your blog in obscurity for 5 years, and all of a sudden, you're linked to by John Gruber, right? I mean, and people will see your blog and realize, oh, this person is a pretty good writer and has some really interesting ideas. Maybe I should, sign up for this RSS, whatever it is. I mean, there's a lot of things like that, and I've felt that a lot of projects that I've taken on in the past that really didn't amount to much of anything ended up putting me in the position to do more productive things in the future. I mean, I've done everything from podcasts that have very few listeners that helped prepare me to be in a position to be able to do something like App Stories or this show with you, to writing an app that did okay, but wasn't going to make a living for me, that got me in touch with someone like you, and we eventually ended up working together. And that certainly wasn't the idea when I wrote an app about affiliate linking, was to get to know Federico Viticci and someday write at Mac Stories. It just kind of happened because it put me in the position of getting to know you, getting to know a lot of people around, all of our friends in kind of this corner of the internet. And eventually that worked out for me in a positive way, working together with you. And none of that was really planned, but there was hard work that went into each of those things, that eventually, when there was an opportunity that presented itself, I was able to take advantage of it because I was ready for it, basically.
I mean, think about it. A few months ago, on one of my other podcasts, Connected, I said, one of the things that I want to do in 2019 is to read more books. And I just sort of almost offhandedly shared some of my basic preferences. Like I said, I can be into sci-fi, but not too geeky, not too nerdy. And I like Harry Potter. I think I said something along those lines.
Right.
And a lot of people get in touch with me. But I saw that one email from, I think, a guy from Poland who said, Federico, based on your tastes, I absolutely think you're going to like Red Rising. And who knew that not only did I fall in love with that series, and I mean, I got a bunch of tattoos that sort of are about Red Rising to prove it, but that series will get me back into reading books. But also that months later, when you approached me about the idea for dialogue, I said, I got just the guy to talk to if he responds to my Twitter DMs. And that was Pierce Brown. And so I guess that sort of goes back to the idea of opening yourself up to external influences. And that for me was to openly talk about the fact that I wanted to read more. And trying new things and being sort of daring in your approach to, I just, out of the blue, I just sent a message to Pierce Brown.
Right.
And it all worked out. And I think always, what's also important for me, we talked about this in an episode of our members only show, Mac Stories Unplugged, the idea that everything is research. And that for me means, I was reading Red Rising, and then you asked me, do you want to do a podcast about creativity? And maybe we could do the first season about writing. And then I just sort of connected the dots, and I said, well, wouldn't it be great if this thing that I'm reading, I could also sort of turn into a work-related assignment. And so we ended up interviewing Pierce Brown. But I think when, finding ways to letting people give you ideas and connecting, all the different dots and making these connections and talking to different folks and, writing about your hobbies, I think it's especially if you're an independent writer, I think it's, for me at least, it's one of the best aspects of my job is to be able to have this process, discovering things, becoming passionate about them, and then writing about them or talking about them. It's definitely something that I gotta keep doing because it seems to be working out well for me.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it all goes back to influences, and it's one of those, and carving out time for ideas, because one of the things that I worry about, I think, more than anything when I'm super busy, is that I realize that I'm living in this little Mac Stories echo chamber sometimes, where all I care about is the 3 stories that I have on my plate. And I'm not watching any TV. I'm not going to the movies. I'm not listening to new music. I'm not reading books. And all of a sudden you realize that all you know about are these 3 apps that are super important that you're writing about. and you get to the end of it, it's like, well, that's no good, because if I keep doing that, then I'm going to have nothing to write about eventually, because I'm not experiencing new things that could influence where I go as a writer going forward. And that's what, when I take a step back and I think, all right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write for this many hours a day. I'm going to deal with the admin stuff for this many hours a day. And then I'm going to have these couple of hours where I just carve out and I do different things. I'll go to a concert, or I'll go read a book, or I'll watch some movie on TV, whatever it is. it does lead to that. And when we did that Everything is Research episode of Mac Stories Unplugged, it was the same thing for me with Frank Turner, who, I don't know, I don't really even know when I became aware of his music. Around 2013. I just went to a show in Chicago, and I really loved it. And I started following him, and I went to a few more concerts. And eventually, when we started doing this show, I thought, you know what? He'd be a really good person to talk about. He's writing a book about songwriting because I've been following his work. He had a new album coming out. I thought he'd be a great person to talk to because we didn't have any songwriters, and that all worked out. I just sent him, like you did with Pierce. I just sent him an email out of the blue, and he said, "Yeah, I'd love to talk to you guys." So, yes, those things, you got to make room for that, because otherwise the well just kind of runs dry, and you don't have any new inspiration for new things. This episode of Dialogue is brought to you by OneBlocker. The first thing you should know about OneBlocker for iOS and the Mac is that it's not just about blocking ads. In fact, you can do a whole lot more with it. What OneBlocker does is declutter every aspect of a website. We've all been on sites with annoying ads that get in the way of the content. OneBlocker can take care of those, but it also addresses other just as annoying things like comments. Comments can be a rabbit hole of negativity and anger. Why let that rub off on you? With OneBlocker, you can enjoy sites and preserve your peace of mind by eliminating comments. Tired of EU cookie notices? OneBlocker handles those too. Newsletter pop-ups that interrupt your reading? Yep, OneBlocker has you covered there as well. You can even set up custom rules just to your liking and whitelist certain categories of content for particular sites. In addition, OneBlocker gives you the tools to protect yourself from online tracking and data collectors. The app's 124,000 rules also make pages load 2 to 3 times faster. To learn more about OneBlocker, go to oneblocker.com today and then download OneBlocker to give it a try. Again, that URL is oneblocker.com. OneBlocker, making the web a faster and safer place on iOS and the Mac. Our thanks to OneBlocker for making this final episode of Season 1 of Dialogue possible.
What else have we learned in this season of Dialogue, John?
Oh boy, what have we learned?
I think the first thing I would say is that all kinds of writers are affected by writer's block. And
Yes.
that it's fine. It happens to everybody, and it's useless to fight it too much. Like, if it's not the kind of day when you're going to get writing done, it's fine. But if it happens for 5 days in a row or 15 days in a row, then maybe you have a problem. But I think the off day that it's just the words are just not coming to you, it happens to everybody.
It absolutely does, and I don't worry about it too much. I mean, if it's not the magic isn't happening that day, I just do other things and I move on and try another day. I think we're fortunate in that a lot of what we do in terms of our writing is somewhat deadline driven, and that's a common topic that came up with a lot of the writers we talked about, is the importance of deadlines. I know John August talked about that, and Carrie Patel also talked about it. And we have deadlines, and some of them are just self-imposed deadlines, of course, but other ones are, the app's coming out and we'd like to have the review out the day that the app launches. And so having a deadline, I think, more than anything else, a lot of times that just jolts me out of complacency and putting things off, and that helps me get things done. I find the things that I find the hardest to get started and to get to the finish line on are projects that are relatively large in scope and aren't something that there's just no deadline. They don't have to be done. They're just something I want to do. And I find that the only way to really get to those is to say, all right, no matter what, I'm going to do this by Friday. And so I better start it today. And then I can usually get it done. But those are the easiest ones to put off, I find.
Yeah. I find that deadlines, I really struggle to meet them unless, when they're self-imposed, they always tend to slip away. But
Yes.
when they're not self-imposed, I tend to respect them. I think I mentioned writer's block. I think it's also something that came up a lot was the idea of being disciplined about carving out time to write consistently with the schedule. The idea of, yes, you can trust the muse of inspiration, and that magical light to just appear in your brain so that 2,000 words just come out of you. But I think writing, this is something that came up a lot. Writing is like a muscle, and if you don't exercise it, it's gonna become harder and harder for you to just come up with your next great novel,
right?
If you haven't been writing for 5 years. So it is absolute. At least for me, writing. I can tell the difference when I go on vacation and I don't write for 2 weeks straight. Then I'm coming back and I'm like, oh well, I guess I've forgotten how to write. And I think it's maybe that's an extreme example, but I think you can be a novelist every 10 years. Well, maybe some people can, but the majority of people, writing is a muscle that needs to be exercised and cared for almost daily, I would say. Or at least even think about writing could help. But, there's maybe exceptions of folks who have come up with a great novel every 2 decades. That's possible, but I feel like most folks, they understand how writing needs to be something that is done on a schedule consistently and that you think about it frequently.
Yeah, I've really taken this aspect of what we heard from our guests to heart, because I've always known that my best writing happens in the morning, not immediately after I roll out of bed, but after a couple of cups of coffee, sit down, start writing. And I'm usually good for 3 to 4 hours, maybe 5 if I'm lucky. And too many days, I think, I fall into the trap of, well, I kind of have these other things I need to deal with, and they may be, whatever they are, there's some sort of administrative task or something. And I figure, well, these are small tasks. I'll get these out of the way first, and then I'll write. And before too long, it's rolling into the afternoon, and I've had lunch, and I'm a little sleepy, and I really don't feel like writing anymore. And I do some writing, but maybe I get a good hour or 2 out of myself. When if I had started right, at the crack of dawn when I was fresh out of bed, I would have gotten a solid 4 hours out of myself. And so what I am trying to do right now, and this is something that I've just really started doing this week, in fact, is get up early, sit down, turn off all notifications, and write for 4 or 5 hours. And this is a time of year when that's useful because we are heading into our busy season and I've got a lot on my plate. And I'm hoping, and we'll see how it works out, I'm hoping that will be a good approach to getting a lot of this writing done that has, maybe before this week, maybe taken a back seat from time to time and not gotten done. Because it's just super easy, I think, it's because writing, as I know, John August talked a little bit about how he hates to write, but he likes the result of writing. I think it's too easy because writing is sometimes very difficult to make it the last thing you do instead of the first thing you do. So I've been trying to kind of push that to the top of the list and move everything else to the back.
Yeah. And in that, I think I would maybe conclude with saying that it's okay to be able to write in your favorite space. Maybe you have your own studio or your favorite room of the house or your favorite table at the, your local coffee shop. And it's easy to obsess over the minutiae of your setup and the apps that you use and the computer that you use. But really, it is also possible to write everywhere. Whether it's on a bus during a travel in Argentina, or maybe you're riding by the beach and you can get your phone out of your pocket and get some writing done. I think it is absolutely essential to have a safe place where you can focus, turn off the lights, get some writing done, pour yourself a whiskey or something, and just write. But also, if maybe your desk is broken or maybe somebody else is in that room, it's also fine. Do not use that as an excuse to not get any writing done.
Yeah, no, the flexibility I think is important because I know that all things equal, I would prefer to sit at my desk in the environment that I've created for myself that I like to work in, or at my iPad, maybe out on the back porch or something. But if I have to, I can also get things done at a coffee shop or on a bus or whatever it happens to be. And being able to, I guess, being realistic about what being in a different environment means in terms of how much you can get done, which is usually means less. being realistic about it is important, but being able to actually do it and be flexible enough to adapt to those other environments is important too.
Well, I think we did it, John. That's season 1 of Dialogue.
I think we did. I think it's been a great season. I want to remind everybody that we will be coming back with a second season, and it'll be on a different topic, but with a similar structure, with an opening show by me and Federico and a closing show by the two of us, as well as interviews in between with special guests. So I hope everybody's enjoyed it. It's been really fun for us to do, and it's been, I think, for us, especially writing about technology day in and day out, it's been interesting to kind of broaden our horizons a little bit and do a little bit about what we've been talking about during this episode, which is expose ourselves not just to other tech writers, but also to people who are writing novels and writing for video games and songwriting and screenplays and all that stuff, because there's something to be learned, I think, from all these different types of writers that are applicable not only to their types of writing, but also to your own as well.
Yeah. And if you just discovered Dialogue and you're listening, somehow you started by listening to the last episode in season 1, you can go to dialoguepodcast.net and you will find season 1 and our you can listen, in any order that you want, but really our recommendation is that you start from the introductory episode that John and I did a couple of months ago, as we're doing this now. It's August, so we did the first episode in April or May, I think, and maybe pick up from there if you're interested in season 1. It's about writers and writing. There's again, bunch of excellent guests that we interviewed in season 1, and as John mentioned, we'll be back eventually at some point in the near future, not in a couple of years, I think, but in the near, not too distant future. We'll be back with another topic, and there will be season 2, sorry. So, but we'll see what happens.
All right, way to commit to season 2, Federico. Sometime in the not too distant future.
Sometime in the not too. It's not, well, if it's 6 months from now, that's not too distant future, right? If it's 6 years from now, that would be a distant future.
That would be the distant future. No, we'll be back in the near future. I want to thank all of our guests from this first season: John Gruber, Carrie Patel, Frank Turner, John August, and Pierce Brown. It's been wonderful talking to them. And of course, you can find me and Federico. We're over at macstories.net. That's where we do our writing. And you can find us both on Twitter and Instagram, where Federico is at Viticci, that's VITICCI, and I'm at John Voorhees, that's JOHN VOORHWS. And I want to thank our two sponsors for this final episode of season 1. That's Astropad and OneBlocker. And we will talk to you next season, Federico.
Arrivederci.